So today, we're diving into a psychological pattern that is just incredibly complex and honestly often really misunderstood. It's something that shows up in families and can echo down through generations. We are talking about the Waif Mother archetype, and we're going to break down what that really means and why it's so important to understand.
We all know this story, right? That feeling of being the lonely, helpless victim left behind while it feels like the whole world is moving on without you. It's such a powerful, almost primal emotion, and it's our doorway into understanding this whole topic.
So yeah, that fairy tale feeling, of being wronged, misunderstood, and just completely alone, that's our starting point. It is the emotional heart of a pattern that has some really profound effects on how a family works.
Look, most of us have felt this way at some point. It's pretty universal. But what happens when that sense of being a victim isn't just a bad day, but it's the very foundation of a mother's entire personality? Well, that's exactly what we're going to get into.
So in psychology, this pattern actually has a name, the waif. But what does that even mean? Let's define it. The key to getting your head around the waif is this image of someone who feels totally lost, adrift, and incredibly fragile. But you've got to pay close attention to that last part. Sharp edges concealed. This isn't just about sadness. Oh no, it is so much more complicated than that. Okay, so that was the clinical definition. But this is what it feels like from the inside. This quote is from the journal of a woman named Angela, a case study from our source material. Her words just give us this raw, unfiltered look into the sheer despair that defines the waif's inner world.
And you know what? This is not some modern thing. Not at all. We can look at historical records, like the letters of Charlotte DuPont from way back in the 1800s, and see an almost identical pattern of just overwhelming despair and this deep, deep sense of being doomed.
All right, so we have a definition. Now let's dig into the why. What is driving this behavior? What is actually happening inside the waif's emotional world?
If you take away only one thing about the waif's inner experience, let it be this. Everything, and I mean everything, is filtered through a lens of profound helplessness. It is the engine driving every thought, every feeling, and every action.
And this is where it gets really tricky, because this helplessness creates this huge internal paradox. On one hand, there's this desperate, overwhelming need for help and comfort, but on the other hand, there's this conflicting need to stay helpless. Because for her, accepting help can feel like a total loss of control. It's an impossible, unwinnable battle.
Wow, this quote from a patient in the research, it just perfectly captures the heart of that struggle. To need help feels like you'll be annihilated, but to be alone is completely unbearable. It is a true psychological trap.
So what's the end result of this constant internal war? It's a feeling of being a perpetual victim. Life feels like something that is just happening to her. She feels cursed, doomed, struck with just endless bad luck, and completely powerless to change any of it.
There's a really powerful metaphor that's used to describe this archetype, a butterfly with a sting. Think about that for a second. Delicate and vulnerable on the surface, but capable of causing real pain to anyone who gets too close. Let's look at how this actually shows up in her behavior.
Well, it often shows up as a kind of passivity. She might be overly permissive with her kids, not because she doesn't care, but because she lacks the internal strength to set boundaries. This feeling of powerlessness often spills into her career, leading to underemployment, and it can even lead to neglecting her own physical health. Fantasy becomes this crucial escape from a reality that just feels way too painful to deal with.
And to cope with all that internal pain, the patterns can get, even more destructive. She might turn to substances or impulsive behaviors with money or relationships. There's this deep-seated feeling of being undeserving that can cause her to unconsciously sabotage the good things that come into her life. And emotionally, this all builds up to intense depression, panic attacks, and a profound fear of being abandoned that can trigger a real crisis.
Okay, but this isn't just about one person, right? This pattern doesn't exist in a vacuum. Its most profound, its most lasting impact is on her children, who are learning everything they know about the world through their mother's eyes.
The research suggests that the wife mother communicates one core message to her children, a kind of motto that ends up shaping their entire worldview.
Life is too hard. That's it. That is the central belief system that she passes on. It's a worldview where life isn't just challenging sometimes. It's fundamentally overwhelming and ultimately hopeless. So through her words, her actions, maybe even her silences, children start to internalize these incredibly painful messages. They hear that they're a burden, that their love isn't really wanted and that they are somehow more deserving of good things than their own mother is, which is such a confusing and heavy weight for any child to carry.
And this creates this devastating cycle. First, the child often feels like they have to become a caretaker, right? They take on responsibility for their parents' very fragile emotions. Then, over time, they absorb that life is too hard motto. To survive, they learn they have to become compulsively self-sufficient, believing deep down that they can't really rely on anyone. And through all of it, they're often battling this deep, deep guilt, as if their parents' unhappiness is somehow all their fault.
Which leaves us with this question that really gets to the very heart of this difficult dynamic. It encapsulates the generational challenge of helplessness, and it really highlights the immense resilience it takes for a child to forge a completely different path, to learn hope when all they were ever taught was despair.